Today, I'm honored to be talking with Dan Mudford, the composer of Shaun of the Dead. Dan, how you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I should point out that I'm the co-composer. I co-composed the score with my longtime friend and colleague Pete Woodhead.
So, starting back a ways, you were producing a show for MTV when you got a copy of Wright's first movie, A Fistful of Fingers. What were your initial thoughts when you saw his work for the first time?
We used to get a lot of VHSs arriving on our desk, unsolicited. And my initial thought was, oh, good, a 180-minute VHS. That means I can record loads of episodes of The Simpsons over it. But out of courtesy, I did actually watch it before taping over it. And at first, I thought, well, picture quality, it didn't really sort of leap out at me, much beyond a student film. But I really noticed the attention to detail in the sound and the sound design, and it became apparent that if you've got the sound good, then the pictures will take care of themselves almost to a degree. I really thought that there was something here, and it was very witty and obviously very sincere in its appreciation of the spaghetti western genre, but with a genuine wit attached to it. So yeah, it was a pleasure to be able to put it on a couple of slots on a daily movie show that we had. So as I've said before, Edgar does owe his entire career to me, and I should just say to people who spend too much time on the internet, sometimes I lie for comic effect.
So, you haven't reached out for residuals, then, is what you're saying?
No. But it was a real pleasure to meet Graham, who played the lead in Fistful of Fingers several years later when he played the living statue in Hot Fuzz, which I shot all the behind-the-scenes stuff for. So, yeah, I was like,
That's right,
I get
yeah.
to fanboy you 10 years after.
You and your collaborator Pete Woodhead were in two bands, Oyuki Conjugate and Sons of Silence together. How did you two meet?
We met through a mutual friend who was living in a squat. I don't know if that translates, but a squat is a place where you live rent-free, basically, semi-legally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Pete had come down from the north of England and was squatting in a pretty run-down flat with a mutual friend of ours who rejoiced in the name of Brian Lustmord, who has since gone on to doing lots of stuff with the Melvins in LA, and he's big on the sort of industrial noise scene. And Pete and I immediately became fast friends through a love of dance music and rock and reggae and also films. And him being a couple of years older than me, I was almost like the younger brother. While I was watching Star Wars and the Goonies and Gremlins, he was watching Dario Argento and all this stuff that I'd never heard of. So he introduced me to all that sort of stuff. The stuff that only got shown in late night cinemas or on very dodgy fourth generation VHSs. And one thing led to another, and we started making music as members of a band called Oyuki Conjugate, who are looking for extra players to perform on a European tour with them. And we all just got on really well. And then we decided to sort of go make a sort of splinter and start doing the sort of music that we wanted with another character called Joe Gardner. And so the three of us made the Sons of Silence.
Music from Sons of Silence was used in Edgar and Simon's first show, Spaced. How did that come about?
Well, that, again, an angel came down in the shape of a comic actor called Paul Putner, who was the taxi driver in Shaun of the Dead, who got cut out. That scene got cut out, unfortunately, but you do get to see him ripping Dylan Moran to pieces at the end. And Paul was very hip to the new sounds that the kids were stumbling around to. And he handed Edgar a CD of ours saying, oh, I think you might like this. And it had loads of film samples on and stuff like that. We had one tune called Jackie Chan, and of course Edgar just went straight for that. He said, never judge a good book by its cover, but you can judge a song by its title. And so, that sort of use of film references, I mean, we sampled things like Mallrats and things, which we thought were pretty obscure, but of course Edgar was all over like a rash. It's like, oh yeah, I love Mallrats, yeah. And then through a mutual friend, Joe Cornish, who directed
Attack the
Block and
love that movie.
The Would Be King, yeah. We actually met in his and his girlfriend's kitchen, and we shook hands, and we both simultaneously said, I really admire your work. Which sounds awful,
fantastic.
but I was a huge fan of Spaced, because I was basically exactly like a cross between Simon and Nick's characters, not in a good way necessarily. And so then Edgar said, "Oh, have you got any tracks that we can use for the next series?" And so, yeah, that was how our sort of relationship started, if you like.
After Space, Edgar Wright realizes your music fits perfectly with his visuals and asks you to do the score for Shaun of the Dead. Had you scored anything before that?
Yes. Pete and I had scored a couple of documentaries. There was one about ice hockey, one or two other theme tunes for shows and stuff like that. But I think what he liked was the fact that we were that whole sort of invisible soundtracks for films that haven't been made sort of thing that was like pioneered by Barry Adamson and people like that in the early 90s. We had done a couple of soundtracks of very small TV shows, but I don't really think that was on our resume as such, so much as the actual music that we were making was very much in the style of soundtracks for films that hadn't been made. Invisible soundtracks, which was a sort of mini subgenre of the mid-90s. And the fact that we used very sort of cinematic sounds and stuff like that. And bless him, he just sort of had faith. I think there was some pushback probably from the film people saying, look, could you at least have one element of this film that is fairly reliable, like i.e. someone who's done it before? Pete reminded me recently actually that I was really worried for quite a long time that because Edgar's such an affable, sociable chap, that he was bound to come into the studio one day and say, hey, guess what? I just met Fatboy Slim or the Chemical Brothers or someone like that. They want to do the soundtrack, and I'd be like, well, yeah, fair enough, But he stuck to his guns, and so very grateful for that, and I like to think we raised our game because of it. It was fairly sort of novice. Certainly it was the first time we'd ever really edited anything to picture, and we kind of invented a way for us to integrate the music and the sounds into the picture itself by literally setting up our studio next to the edit suite, watching a reel and then doing some stuff and then putting it onto CD because that's what you had to do, and then giving the individual tracks to Chris, the editor, and saying, put this on, try it on, and it goes in there and comes out there. So it kind of became embedded with the soundtrack, so people couldn't unpick it.
So you guys got set up in the office next to them in the Delane Leah?
Yeah, Delane Lee.
Okay. You're in the room right next door to Chris Dickens, the editor, and Edgar's there too. Since he's in such close proximity to you guys, I'm assuming he's coming over and helping and giving notes as far as the score and what he wanted you to do. How involved with the score was Edgar with you guys?
Absolutely. I mean, if he could have, I'm sure if he knew anything about music, I mean, obviously he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of music from the last 40 years. The actual technicalities of sound and stuff like that is something that they don't teach in film school. It's weird. I mean, he didn't go to film school, but you can learn all about lights and what lights to use and what lenses do and what the effect of changing a lens is. But music sort of somehow retains some sort of abstract mystery for a lot of directors, obviously, John Carpenter being the big exception. So Edgar would come next door. Often Chris had gone home for the evening. Then Edgar, being like a 24-hour working guy, came next door and said, right, so leading up to this cut, or, I want it to go like this. And he would literally sort of like throw himself at the screen. And I would sometimes have to physically stop him from leaping across the desk and stuff. I'm not going to lie, it was really, really, really hard. No one is prepared for his level of attention to detail. I certainly wasn't. I mean, I've been really good about it since, but this was the first time that I've been like, oh, what, really? I mean, it's, it's a sound that's, in amongst a whip pan of zombies running along, and it's a 9-frame shot that he wants accentuating with a sound that flags it up. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then it became apparent that this was the way it was. A, it was the way it was going to be. And B, this is what made it so good and so watchable, is there is no slackness.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection between what his vision was and your music, for sure.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that young filmmakers have with British crew, there's very much a sort of this'll do attitude towards a lot of what British people do. Edgar knew that people like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and stuff like that don't do that, subscribe to that, So he said, right, well, I'm not going to either. Otherwise, how am I going to be as good as them? And so, yeah, we all had to really raise our game, and it went on for a lot longer than it should have done. But It was extremely rewarding, and I still watch it every time it's on TV.
You said it took a little longer. It took, what, 6 months for the whole process, right?
Yeah, normally what happens is they lock the picture, and then the
Hmm.
composer's given like 6 weeks, and then the composer hands it in with about 3 days to go
Right.
and goes, "Here it is." And they go, "Okay, thanks." And they say, "Could you make some changes?" And I say, "I'm sorry, but I'm already on to Gladiator or..." But we didn't do this. We said we want to make this as good as possible. And there was stuff that we came up with in the last couple of weeks. The scenes that I think are the most effective sound-wise came very late. You know, when we really thought that we'd given all we could, suddenly you got your second wind, if you like. Okay, how about we start this scene again with a completely different feel? And wow, it works. You know, this was Mum's death, Barbara's death scene was a very late, you know, I was pretty much on my own by this point. Just, it was more or less an editing process. And the way that came together almost at the last minute, I'm very, very pleased that we made that extra effort, because I find it very effective still.
What's the biggest difference between being a musical artist and then changing gears into a composer, having to have your music actually fit into a puzzle piece?
Well, obviously the discipline of timing is a big difference. Like when we first started making music for release on CD and album, generally it just seemed to be that the average track length in those days was about 6 minutes, which is nowadays I listen to it and I think, oh, God, this is going, you know, let's come on, cut to the chase, chaps. It sort of like found that our approach fitted really well. And basically what we did was we shot rushes and edited exactly the way that a filmmaker would. We would do long improvised sessions based on a certain feel, or, you know, like, okay, so this is going to be like really, really different levels of doominess, basically. It's like, well, this is up-tempo doomy, so this could go in the garden scene, but this is like the really, really heavy stuff, which is in the Winchester towards the end. And then there's the big explosive stuff that happens in the big bar fight at the end. And then it was just a question of editing it all down. And I had a copy of Pro Tools, which was the editing software that everybody used at the time. Don't tell any of the film company this. The version that I had actually came free with a magazine. But initially we were using a free sort of demonstration version of Pro Tools that came with some techie synthesizer mag. But, you know, it worked. And so that's how I learnt to edit. And also because I had also been a director of documentaries and stuff, I kind of knew about the process of making sound work to pictures and vice versa sometimes. It sounds like a cliche to say, but it just felt like a really organic process. And the music that we made after Shaun of the Dead was very much more tightly controlled, if you like, and much more heavily edited with lots and lots of sound effects, rather than just these sort of long rambling, get a beat going and you just sort of like let it run for 6 minutes or something like that.
You mentioned before that you tried to steer away from using software and use more analog devices. What inspired that direction?
Age is just age. I bought my first synthesizers when I was at school, aged about 15 and 16, and I wasn't a sports boy. And I spent most of my teens in the cellar of my parents' house with the nerdiest guy in the year above me. I mean, that's how nerdy he was, that he hung out with someone who was the year below, you know, a year younger than him. And we built synthesizers and made sort of sub-craft work, sort of Jean-Michel Jarre type music in the early 80s. And so by the time music became much more software based, you could always hear what bit of software that everybody was using. I mean, even what bit of equipment. There was a famous period where everybody used one particular thing called a Sherman filter bank, and every hit dance record had it. And it was amazing. It sounded fantastic. I would have bought one if I could have afforded it. I didn't. And so you just have to sort of make do with what you've got. And so, yeah, we didn't use any sort of like computer synthesizer software or anything like that, you know, GarageBand or anything sort of fancier than that. We used lots of old gear just to retain that sort of slightly gritty, unpredictable feel, and a feel that's kind of hard to recreate. There's a lot of music in Shaun of the Dead that isn't recognisable as music at all. There's 49 minutes of organised sound, basically. And a lot of it is just like very, very heavy sub-bass drones that are played on a sort of detuned guitar through loads of effects and just stuff like that that's just not quite what you'd hear on one of those, library CDs, basically. It's not library music. Mm-hmm. When Edgar wanted to use library music, he could, and he did. We tried to do our own version of it, but he said, no, I think I'll stick with the original. Okay, you win that one.
You said in the past that Pete brought a vast knowledge of horror scores into your recording sessions, and he has said that you were the one who was able to tie all the sounds together. Talk to me about that kind of partnership and how that played out in the studio.
We were very similar, but we had some important differences in our skill set, if you like. He had an almost Edgar Wright level knowledge of Italian horror films and things like that, which I had not been privy to because I was... Well, I'm a sensitive soul, Deke, and I'm not very good at watching horror films. I mean, I'm still genuinely terrified by Paddington 2. I was traumatised by Alice in Wonderland as a child, and so, I still haven't seen The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby or anything like that. I'm a sensitive soul, and I haven't seen any of these horror films that Pete grew up watching. I mean, he's amazed that he's such a nice, level-headed man as a result.
Right. Were there any particular film scores you guys were using for inspiration?
Well, Edgar steered us in the direction of Ennio Morricone's score for The Thing, and cool. Also Suspiria and other soundtracks by the Italian group Goblin.
Yes.
Which, again, I hadn't heard of, but Pete knew all about Dario Argento's films. So he said, oh, yeah, this sort of thing. I tried not to be too influenced. I mean, I think the influence of The Thing is fairly obvious in the main sort of bomb, bomb, bomb thing that goes throughout. But I really tried to almost subversively sneak influences in that Edgar wouldn't have been aware of, just so that it didn't feel like a reference fest, basically. It wasn't out of any sort of snobbery or anything like that. I just thought it'd be easier to try and see if I can get away with putting my own stamp on it of the stuff that I brought to it. Pete was very well versed in sort of American funk of the 70s and hip hop and stuff like that. He's very good with beats and stuff like that. So he bought the beats and he bought the blood. And I bought a sense, I don't know what I did actually. I think I just sort of watered it all down so it was acceptable to...
I don't know about that, but you brought it together to work. I don't know about watered it down.
I was listening to a lot of a group called Coil at the time. The later half of the film is very heavily Coil influenced. There's lots of very dark and heavy synthesizer stuff going on in there. But also the idea of that music is just organised sounds. And so there's a lot of just sort of what one pretentiously might call music concrete that's not recognisable as music, which again caused its problems when we were playing it to the film company, because they were sort of... At one point, the music supervisor said, could we have like something, like a tune at some point, perhaps, maybe? Like a tune would be nice. Here's 3 notes. When Shaun and Ed bang heads at the end, I mean, bless Edgar and Chris Dickens, the editor, were both so much on our side about the fact that the sound and the pictures were working together almost as one, that they didn't let anybody push us around and say, can we have a singable theme tune?
The score is very beat orientated, and the hero of the movie is a DJ. Was it an intentional connection?
No. It wasn't at all.
It sure works though, because if the story's kind of told from his viewpoint, like that score perfectly matches.
It hadn't really occurred to me that Shaun was a DJ. I mean, he was sort of like, they have that session.
He's DJ Smiley Riley in the movie.
The beats are there because it was such a major part of the stuff that we did. Basically, a lot of our music was just beats with noises over the top. And if you repeat a certain noise enough times, then it starts to take on a melodic element to it. I'm only half joking there. Yeah, so, no, I mean, as far as I was concerned, I only really saw Shaun as a sort of slightly underachieving young man working in an electronics shop who liked to play records, at the weekend, which we all do. if we've got a
Yeah.
shitty job.
I love that when you look at Shaun of the Dead being told from the viewpoint of Shaun, the fact that the score would be done in almost like a DJ type style with beats like that, I was like, man, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Did you guys ever have writer's block or themes that you guys struggled with more than others?
No, we had ideas pouring out all the time,
Wow.
which was fantastic. I mean, no, we never had.
That's a good problem to have.
Well, yeah, it's always best to edit down than build up. We were very lucky in that, as far as I remember, we had a pretty good hit rate of suggestions of, basic tracks, and said, try this on this scene and see how it goes. And basically that works. And they go, well, okay, we'll finesse it over the next few weeks in the edit. Edgar, knowing so much music, we felt confident that if we did ever get stuck, that he would have a fallback, like he did with the scene that was known as The Plan, where they're going, we kill Phil, go to the Winchester. That Edgar had this piece of music on the temp track, which was, I'm pretty sure, was by Goblin.
Yeah.
And we tried several alternatives to that in a similar style. I could have made them work as far as Edgar was concerned. He had his heart set on this, and fair enough, it's his film.
Yeah.
Likewise, a lot of people were surprised that the opening theme music isn't by us, because it does sound an awful like us. And it's a great tune. I don't know if I could have ever come up with something as catchy as the la 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 thing at the beginning. We always had options, and we were quite quick workers, and also we felt really in tune with the film. Between Pete and I, we were really felt comfortable with the genre of horror and comedy and the feel of what we'd done with Spaced. It wasn't a total joy because it was such hard work, but now the body has no memory of pain. I can look back on it with fondness.
The scene when Shaun is on the phone with his mom is one of the funniest scenes in the movie. Your score is used as a comedic punchline when it comes to a screeching halt during that scene. Were you aware Edgar was going to utilize and manipulate your music to such a comedic effect throughout the movie?
That's exactly the sort of thing that we did. I mean, I can't remember whether that was whose idea that was. I'll give the credit to Edgar, but we actually physically did it, because you can actually do that stuff where you can just drop stuff out. One joke that I tried to do that probably doesn't land all that well because it's a bit too subtle. When they're singing White Lines, Don't Do It, there's a drone underneath it going, sort of ominous. And then that drone changes key when they go to the get higher baby. So it's actually sort of soundtracking their version of thing. There's reasons why my comedy career isn't all that successful. That one didn't land, but I know it's there. But no, I mean, doing those dropouts and things like that, I really love the idea of emphasizing things with silence rather than having all the time, because there's enough of that going on, for God's heaven knows there's enough chaotic stuff going on. So sometimes it's just really nice just to go drop the beat, let someone say the gag, and it starts up again. And it's like,
it's such an accentuation to that joke. It just makes that scene so much funnier. It's just to have the music immediately come to a screeching halt, and it goes right back up once you realize it was Philip who got bit. I think it's so funny.
It's like, it's
a good one. There's other scenes in there too, like when Shaun is walking to the convenience store and he trips going up the curb. You add in a little record skip in there. I thought that was really cool.
Thank you.
Talk to me about things like that.
There's a little spot effects that we put in, basically. So when he shuts the gate, there's a pew, and isn't that where the kid kicks the football at Shaun's head or something like that? There's a sound effect there. And we did a little backwards, little rewind, speaking technically for a moment. We did a little rewind on that little bit where he trips, and I think there's another one where he slips on the blood as he walks into the convenience store. And that sort of stuff is really, really, really good fun to do, because it's just like putting little bings and bongs and stuff like that in.
It works. It totally works. It's great. I'm a home theater enthusiast, and I got to tell you, just screening Shaun of the Dead last night, man, the highlight of surround effects and like the separation of channels is definitely your score. I mean, your score really hits all over the place. It's fantastic to listen to in any kind of surround sound setup.
That's great.
Oh man, it's a blast.
I'm afraid to say that I'm not a home cinema person.
I got to tell you, if you get into it, your score is fantastic in surround sound.
Do you know, I've never listened to it in 5.1 since we spent a week mixing it in a studio with a guy, and I'm going to give him credit for that because it was a difficult time. He was an interesting character. He just wore a singlet. He wore a wife beater all the time, which is kind
That's
of like...
it?
He said, "Oh, can we finish early because I've got a colonic irrigation at 5 o'clock?" And we'd be like, "Okay."
You can't say no to that.
Edgar and Chris Dickens came round to listen to how it was going, and this guy was sort of had a little bit of the old school itis about him, and Edgar said, "Oh, we felt as though we'd sort of been sent away with a flea in our ear at the end of the session." But I'm really pleased that it sounds good, because Nigel, the sound mixer, he was having to wear 2 pairs of glasses so that he could see the screen. The sessions went on for so long and so late. He goes, "I can't even see the damn..."
Oh, man. So his vision was getting blurry from working so many hours?
Yeah, it's just...
Wow.
And then the assistant, who was this young kid, he did all the scratching when they're playing It's Not Hip Hop, It's Electro.
Right, yeah.
So that was just like the equivalent of the tape op, like 15, 16-year-old guy who just happened to be able to do the requisite amount of scratching.
Funny. Do you own the vinyl of the soundtrack?
Yes, I do.
I do too. And it's cool because on the sticker, it has the electro sticker, just like the record that Pete, the roommate, throws out the window.
Yeah.
It's so cool. It's such a funny little gag, like just as a purchaser. It's awesome. I love it. What are your memories of attending the premiere and watching Shaun of the Dead fully assembled with an audience?
It was amazing because I'd been to lots of premieres before as part of TV crews. So I'd always been on the other side of the railings going, "Excuse me, MTV." It was in Leicester Square, which is where they have all the premieres. And Chris Dickens, the editor, Tina, the assistant editor, Pete and I, we had a nice drink in the bar in the hotel across, and we walked across and walked through up, and it was amazing because you could feel all the cameras' lights turning off as we walked up. Because they realised, save your batteries, lads. There's nothing to... No. So that was... And then we went in, and there were speeches, and Pete and I sat next to each other, and it was awesome seeing and hearing it. We'd spent half our lives in cinemas, and just seeing this and hearing this, and the reaction was so great. And again, then we went to the party afterwards, and I'd again been to loads of those parties, trying to grab a word with Spike Lee, who doesn't want to be there because he wants to be watching the baseball game or something like that. And I said to Pete, "Right, we belong here. We're part of this,
right.
And so I'm going to go and fanboy everybody." And the first person I went up to was Bill Nighy, and I said, "Hello, my name's Dan. I did the music." And he goes, "Oh, great, yeah." I said, "I heard you on the radio the other day playing Rolling Stones." He goes, "Oh, yeah." And we talked about Rolling Stones for 5 minutes, and it was like, yes, this is why.
This is why I did 6 months of work on
Yes.
this movie. To talk to Bill Nye. That's awesome. So the reaction from the audience was fantastic?
Yeah, it was really good. It was a home crowd. I mean, a lot of the people that were there at the time have since gone on to great things. They were sort of like just a couple of steps behind Edgar as far as filmmaking and TV making were going. Mm-hmm. And it was just like a sense of, God, we really pulled this off. And it's actually a proper film that deserves to be shown in cinemas. And it looks great and it sounded really good. And so, it's
definitely something to be proud of, for sure.
Yeah.
In our exchanges before the interview, I could tell you were a fan of movies. If you had to narrow down your top 3 scores of all time, could you do that?
Yes. Okay. Top 3, Eraserhead.
Nice. Okay.
I bought the CD of Eraserhead about 15 years before I saw the film. I had listened to it a lot, and when I saw the visuals, I was like, oh my God. Aguirre, The Wrath of God, which is a film by Werner Herzog, who often worked with a German group it's a one-man band, basically, called Popol Vuh. And the opening of Aguirre, The Wrath of God is the most incredible combination of pictures and music I've ever heard. It's one of those movies, like RoboCop or Tremors, that I can watch, if it's too early for bed but too late for freehand. And you go, I'll just watch the first half hour of Aguirre. Gosh. I really like the soundtrack of Tremors, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I could be cool and say sort of Carter Burwell, who's always really good. Tremors is another of my favourite films. And there's a scene in that where they're doing pole vaulting from rock to rock to rock. And something happens in the music there that just makes me well up every single time. And I've seen it a lot of times. Again,
Wow.
RoboCop, which you were talking about earlier, that's number 4. That's always fantastic. Gosh, I mean, I could go on. Dudley Moore's soundtrack to Bedazzled, the original
Wow.
one from the 60s. And all the John Barry stuff. John Barry,
mhm.
I mean, kind of goes without saying, really. I was privileged enough to spend a few hours with him a couple of years before he died, because I delivered flowers to his house in Long Island. We chatted, and that was really nice. And he gave away a few of his secrets, which I never got to use because it's completely different. But all his
Right.
stuff. I mean, I grew up with the Bond movies, the 1960s spy movies, and all that sort of thing. I still love that stuff.
So do I. I got a couple of the vinyls of his scores. I love them.
Yeah, the Ipcress file and things like that. The knack and how to use it. And stuff like that. It's
Yeah.
quite some of the
Yeah.
films that aren't so great. And the same with Ennio Morricone. There's some not so great films, but the music is always really amazing. Danger Diabolique is another of my favourite. Morricone did a sort of swinging, groovy 60s rock and roll soundtrack to that, and it's hilarious and fantastic.
Nice. Are you amazed how well Shaun of the Dead has been received and continues to live on as one of the most popular films of the past 20 years?
Yeah, well, I guess I am, because it is a horror film and it does have some of the worst language possible that I wouldn't dream of using, certainly in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say, because you can see why Four Weddings and a Funeral or Notting Hill, or as far as British films go from the last 20 or 30 years, you can see why that's got an enduring appeal. The relationship between Simon and Nick and Shaun and Ed is very, very real. There's that thing called chemistry, which no one can fake, and the attention to detail that makes it watchable. There are scenes which have no score on them. I never really bothered to watch when we were working on the film. So I'm like, oh, still when I watch it. Like, I've just moved house. I'm just setting up a new studio in here. I treated myself to a new TV. Not a sound system, admittedly, but a new big telly. And the first thing I watched to sort of like calibrate it, if you like, because I know what it's supposed to look and sound like, was Shaun of the Dead. And I ended up
Nice.
watching the whole damn thing again. And I was like, yay!
Yeah, it's super enjoyable, even if you were involved with it. It's still fun to
Yeah.
watch, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of films that I've worked on in various capacities that really you just go, ooh, ooh, oh dear. I'm glad I wasn't heavily involved in that. I'm
Right.
glad I didn't give that one my all. But this one, I really am. I mean, I'm so delighted that this one has lasted so well. It's amazing. It's like a dream
Yeah.
come true, really.
Just so you know, in case you haven't been over here, you're not aware of the viewpoint of the States and how they view Shaun of the Dead. It is one of the most perfect movies. You can't find a single person who hasn't heard of it and has anything mean to say about it. So I just want to let you know that, in case you weren't aware of that.
That is so nice.
No,
That is
it's one of the
fantastic.
most perfect films over here in the States. We love it over here. I mean, like, to an insane amount. It's crazy, honestly. Edgar Wright's obviously a big, huge hit over here, but definitely Shaun of the Dead. It's one of those movies that everybody can watch. Everyone has a great time enjoying it. I can't thank you enough for chatting to me about your experiences making one of the most enjoyable movies of the past 20 years, Dan. I thank you so
That
much
is
for
so
taking time,
nice.
sir.
Thank you so much. It really is. I know that if I remind my nephews, or if I come across any of my friends' kids, they say, Dan did the music for Shaun of the Dead. And I go,
Right.
oh, okay. Yeah, that's so nice. Well, thank you very much.